Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a hidden side of Regency England, a world where some women formed deep romantic relationships with other women while living under the strict rules of high society. As always, get comfortable, relax, and let the story slowly carry you back into the past. Imagine waking up in a grand English manor sometime around the year 1815. The morning sunlight filters through heavy curtains while servants quietly move through the halls. Outside, horse-drawn carriages roll along muddy roads, and society is governed by rules so strict that nearly every aspect of life is watched and judged. Reputation is everything. A careless rumour can damage a family standing for years. Women are expected to marry respectable men, produce heirs, and devote themselves to the duties of family life. Yet beneath this polished surface, another reality exists. In drawing rooms, gardens, libraries, and private correspondence, some women develop relationships that go far beyond ordinary friendship. Too modern as many of these aren't romantic. Women exchange passionate letters filled with affection. They speak of longing, devotion, and heartbreak. Some spend years living together. Others choose each other over marriage. What makes this especially fascinating is that society often fails to recognize these relationships for what they may have been. Many people in Regency England simply cannot imagine women engaging in romantic relationships with one another because of this assumption. Women are sometimes granted a freedom that men do not enjoy. Two women may hold hands, exchange intimate letters, or spend countless hours together without attracting the same level of suspicion. This does not mean their lives are easy. A woman still depends heavily on family approval and financial security. Marriage remains one of the few acceptable paths available to most women. Refusing marriage can lead to gossip and questions. Yet some women quietly create lives that follow a different course. One famous example involves pairs of women who choose to live together in arrangements, known later as romantic friendships. These households often appear respectable from the outside. Neighbours may see two unmarried ladies sharing a home and assume they are simply companions. Behind closed doors, however, their emotional bonds can be far deeper than society realises. Their letters reveal affection so intense that modern historians continue debating exactly how these relationships should be understood. As evening falls over Regency England, candles flicker in elegant homes. Music drifts through parlours, and conversations continue long into the night. Somewhere among these gatherings, hidden in plain sight, are women creating connections that challenge the expectations of their age. Their stories survive in faded diaries, preserved letters, and whispered memories that allow us to glimpse a side of history often left untold. For many women of the Regency period, letters became the safest place to express feelings that could not always be spoken aloud. The postal system was improving, and correspondence played a major role in everyday life. Friends often exchanged letters several times a week. At first glance, many surviving letters appear ordinary, but a closer reading reveals emotions of remarkable intensity. Women wrote that they could not bear long separations. They described sleepless nights, constant thoughts of one another, and overwhelming happiness whenever a reunion approached. Some letters contain language so passionate that modern readers are often surprised. Yet, within the culture of the time, expressions of affection between women were not automatically viewed as scandalous. Ambiguity created a unique space where powerful emotional relationships could exist without immediate public condemnation. Still, life was never completely free of risk. Families often expected daughters to marry, especially if a suitable gentleman appeared. Marriage brought financial security and social stability. A woman who repeatedly rejected marriage proposals might attract unwanted attention. Relatives could begin asking questions. Friends might wonder why she remained devoted to a particular companion. Because of these pressures, many women faced difficult choices. Some entered conventional marriages despite their personal feelings. Others remained unmarried and attempted to build independent lives together. Such independence was rare because women possessed limited legal rights and often depended on family wealth or inheritance. This is why relationships between women were frequently shaped not only by emotion, but also by practical concerns about money, housing, and social acceptance. Among the most famous examples were pairs of women who became nearly inseparable. They travelled together, shared homes, and organised their lives around each other. Visitors sometimes remarked on their closeness but rarely challenged it openly. Society often preferred simple explanations. Two respectable ladies living together seemed easier to understand than the possibility of a romantic partnership. This silence could act as a form of protection. Yet it also meant that many relationships remained hidden from history. Unlike public marriages, these partnerships rarely appeared in official records. Historians must piece together evidence from personal writings, household accounts, and the observations of friends. As we move deeper into this story, we begin to see how these women navigated a world filled with expectations. They learned when to remain quiet, when to be cautious, and when to trust one another. In elegant ballrooms illuminated by candlelight, and in peaceful countryside homes far from London's crowded streets, they created private worlds of companionship that sometimes lasted for decades. Their experiences remind us that human emotions have always been more complex than the rules societies attempt to impose upon them. Not every relationship between women in the Regency era was hidden away in remote cottages or private estates. Some existed in the very heart of society itself, at grand dinners, musical evenings, and elegant house parties. Women often spent long hours together without attracting suspicion. A young lady could openly admire another woman's beauty, intelligence, or charm. She could dance attendance upon her, write affectionate notes, and seek her company whenever possible. Such behaviour was generally viewed as harmless friendship, because society underestimated the possibility of romantic feelings between women. Many relationships remained largely invisible to outside observers. Yet, invisibility was not always the same as freedom. Women lived under constant observation. Servants noticed routines. Family members discussed behaviour. Neighbours paid attention to visitors. Rumours travelled surprisingly fast through Regency social circles. If a relationship appeared too exclusive, or caused a woman to reject multiple marriage opportunities, whispers sometimes began to circulate. These rumours rarely accused women directly of romantic involvement. Instead, critics might describe a friendship as unhealthy, excessive, or improper. Even vague suspicions could create difficulties. Reputation was one of the most valuable possessions a woman had, and protecting it required careful judgment. Some women developed subtle ways of maintaining privacy. They used coded language in letters. They referred to deep emotions using terms that could be interpreted as friendship. They arranged visits through trusted relatives. In cases, the people closest to them may have understood far more than official records reveal. Families sometimes tolerated these relationships as long as public. Appearances remained respectable. Silence often served everyone's interests. The most important thing was avoiding scandal. This environment produced a strange contradiction. Certain forms of affection were visible everywhere, yet their deeper meaning remained hidden behind social conventions. Historians examining surviving documents often encounter this challenge. A letter may describe intense devotion, promises of lifelong loyalty, and profound emotional attachment. Was it friendship, romance, or something that existed between the categories available at the time? The answer is not always clear. What is clear is that these relationships mattered enormously to the women involved. Their words revealed joy, longing, jealousy, comfort, and heartbreak, the same emotions that have shaped human relationships throughout history. As another quiet evening settles across Regency England, candlelight flickers against the walls of drawing rooms and country houses. Somewhere, a woman unfolds a letter written by someone she cherishes above all others. She reads each line carefully, knowing that within those pages exists a connection that gives meaning and warmth to her life, even in a society that may never fully understand it. As the years passed, some of these women discovered that maintaining a lifelong partnership required far more than affection alone. Regency England was a world deeply shaped by money, inheritance, and social status. Love could bring happiness, but financial independence often determined whether two women could remain together. A wealthy widow or an unmarried woman with a comfortable inheritance possessed freedoms unavailable to most others. She could choose where to live, whom to invite into her home, and how to organise her daily life. For women without such resources, the future was often uncertain. Marriage remained the safest path to economic security, even when it conflicted with personal desires. This reality forced many women into painful decisions. Some accepted marriages arranged through family expectations, while trying to preserve important emotional bonds in private. Others remained unmarried despite pressure from relatives who worried about their future. In letters and diaries, traces of these struggles occasionally appear. There are accounts of women grieving when a beloved companion married. Some describe feelings of abandonment. Others speak of maintaining correspondence for years after separation, hoping their connection would survive changing circumstances. These emotions remind us that the challenges faced by people seeking meaningful relationships are not unique to the modern world. Human hearts have always struggled against practical realities. Among the most remarkable stories are those of women who successfully built shared lives together for decades. They managed households, entertained guests, travelled, and cared for one another through illness and old age. To outsiders, they might have appeared to be respectable companions. Yet their commitment often resembled that of devoted spouses. In an era before modern definitions and identities existed, they created relationships according to their own understanding of love, loyalty, and companionship. Historians continue debating how these partnerships should be interpreted, but the emotional evidence left behind is impossible to ignore. The surviving letters reveal tenderness, devotion, and a desire to remain together despite obstacles. As the Regency era slowly gave way to a changing 19th century, many of these stories faded into obscurity. Some letters were destroyed by families. Diaries disappeared. Personal papers were edited to protect reputations. What remains is only a fragment of a much larger history, yet its teaser. Fragments offer a fascinating glimpse into lives that rarely appeared in official records. They remind us that beneath the strict rules, formal manners, and elegant appearance of Regency society existed real people searching for connection, understanding, and affection. Their experiences survived not because they challenged the world with public declarations, but because they quietly preserved their feelings in words that still speak. Across to centuries of history, one of the most interesting aspects of these relationships is how differently they were viewed compared to similar relationships between men. During the Regency period, society treated male same-sex relationships with extreme hostility. Severe punishments could follow accusations, and public scandals ruined lives. Women, however, existed in a different social category. Many people simply believed that women were naturally less interested in physical desire and more concerned with emotion, friendship, and family. Because of this belief, intense affection between women was often dismissed as harmless. Ironically, the same assumptions that limited women's independence also provided a degree of protection for certain relationships. Society was looking in one direction while many important stories unfolded in another. This does not mean every woman who formed a close friendship with another woman was involved in a romantic relationship. Deep friendships were common and valued throughout the era. Friends shared personal thoughts, exchanged gifts, and expressed affection in ways that may seem unusual today. This is what makes the historical evidence so fascinating. Modern historians must carefully examine each case without making assumptions. Some relationships appear to have been friendships of extraordinary depth. Others contain clues suggesting something more. The truth often exists in a grey area where simple labels fail to capture the complexity of real human lives. Meanwhile, daily life continued around them. London remained crowded with carriages, merchants, and fashionable social events. In the countryside, families gathered for dinners, card games, and long walks through carefully maintained gardens. Young women attended balls hoping to secure a prosperous future. Parents worried about advantageous marriages. Yet behind these familiar scenes, countless personal stories unfolded beyond the attention of official history. Many women found comfort in knowing there was at least one person who understood them completely. In a society where public behaviour was carefully controlled, private companionship could become a source of strength and happiness. Some women described their companions as the most important people in their lives. Others planned futures together despite uncertainty. They shared hopes, fears, and ambitions that could not always be discussed openly with the wider world. As the years passed, these bonds often grew stronger through adversity. Separation, illness, financial troubles, and family pressure tested many relationships. Some survived for decades. Others ended in heartbreak. Yet, whether their stories concluded with lifelong companionship or painful distance, they reveal a side of Regency England rarely shown in grand tales of kings, wars, and politics. History is not only shaped by famous leaders and dramatic events. It is also shaped by quiet moments between ordinary people whose emotions, dreams, and relationships were every bit as real as our own. As historians continued studying personal letters from the Regency era, they began noticing patterns that had long been overlooked. In archives across Britain, boxes of old correspondence revealed relationships filled with devotion, loyalty, and emotional intimacy. Some women wrote hundreds of letters over the course of their lives. These letters often described the smallest details of daily existence. Yet, between those ordinary observations appeared expressions of affection that remain deeply moving even today. A woman might count the days until she could see her companion again. She might describe feeling lonely whenever they were apart. She might preserve a lock of hair, a small gift, or a treasured note as a cherished reminder of someone special. Such actions demonstrate how meaningful these relationships could become. Yet understanding these women requires remembering that they lived in a very different world. Modern concepts of identity did not exist in the same way. People understood relationships through the language and expectations of their own time. For this reason, historians must resist the temptation to force the past into modern categories. Instead, they examine how people describe themselves and their experiences. What emerges is a picture of remarkable diversity. Some women appear to have viewed their relationships primarily as emotional partnerships. Others seem to have shared bonds that closely resemble romantic relationships as we understand them today. The variety itself is an important reminder that human relationships have always been complex. Beyond personal correspondence, there are occasional glimpses in literature and popular culture of the era. Novels, poems, and private writings sometimes hinted at deep attachments between women. These references were usually subtle rather than explicit. Writers understood the boundaries of acceptable discussion and often relied on implication rather than direct statements. Readers familiar with these social realities could sometimes recognize meanings hidden beneath polite language. In Sisvir, stories and poems became another place where emotions could be expressed safely. Meanwhile, the wider world continued changing. The Regency period eventually ended. New generations arrived with different attitudes and concerns. Political reforms, industrial growth, and social transformations reshaped British society. Yet many of the women whose lives we are exploring disappeared from public memory. Their achievements were rarely celebrated, and their relationships were seldom recorded in official histories. Only fragments remained. A surviving diary entry, a collection of letters tucked away in an archive, a brief mention in a family memoir. Piece by piece, These fragments allow modern researchers to reconstruct lives that would otherwise have been forgotten. They reveal women who navigated a restrictive society with intelligence, patience, and resilience. Most importantly, they remind us that the search for companionship, understanding, and love is a timeless part of the human experience. Across centuries of change, those desires remain remarkably familiar, connecting their world to ours in ways that continue to fascinate historians today. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson from these stories is not simply that such relationships existed, but that they survived despite the limitations of the age. Regency society placed women within a narrow set of expectations. Their futures were often planned by families, influenced by wealth, and restricted by social convention. Yet, within those boundaries, many women still found ways to create meaningful lives on their own terms. Some discovered happiness through lifelong companionship. Others found comfort in letters that crossed long distances and carried affection from one town to another. Even when circumstances forced separation, the emotional connections they formed often remained powerful for years. Today, historians continue uncovering new evidence that adds depth to our understanding of these lives. Every diary, letter, and personal account offers another small window into a world that official records largely ignored. What makes these stories so compelling is their humanity. They are not tales of famous battles or royal ceremonies. They are stories about people seeking connection in a complicated world. Their hopes, fears, and desires feel surprisingly familiar, despite the passage of more than 200 years. As candlelight faded each night across Regency England and the sounds of carriages disappeared into the darkness, countless private lives continued beyond the attention of history books. In quiet bedrooms, elegant parlours, and peaceful countryside homes, women wrote letters, shared conversations, and built relationships that gave meaning to their lives. Though many of their names have been forgotten, the emotions they left behind remain. Through their words, they continue to remind us that history is filled with hidden stories, waiting to be discovered. Yet there is another reason these stories continue to capture the imagination of modern historians. They reveal how much of history can disappear when society chooses not to record certain experiences. Official documents from the Regency period were usually concerned with property, inheritance, politics, and marriage. They rarely described private emotions in detail. As a result, many women who spent decades sharing their lives with one another left behind only scattered traces of evidence. Sometimes a historian may spend years studying a collection of letters before realizing the extraordinary story hidden within them. A simple phrase repeated over and over, a promise to remain together forever. Expressions of grief that seem far deeper than ordinary friendship. These details gradually build our picture that official records never intended to preserve. In some cases later, generations unknowingly contributed to this disappearance. Family members occasionally edited letters before donating them to archives. Certain passages were removed. Some documents were destroyed entirely. Victorians, who came after the Regency generation, often preferred presenting relatives as respectable examples of conventional family life. Anything that appeared unusual could be quietly omitted. Because of this, historians must work carefully, comparing different sources and searching for clues that survived by chance. What remains is often incomplete, but even incomplete evidence can be powerful. Consider a woman growing older in Regency England. She has spent years sharing a home with her closest companion. Together, they have faced illnesses, financial worries, family disputes, and personal losses. They know each other's habits, preferences, and fears better than anyone else. Their relationship has become the foundation of daily life. When one eventually dies, the surviving partner may experience profound loneliness. Some surviving letters describe grief so intense that it lasted 4 years. Reading these words today, it becomes impossible to dismiss such relationships as insignificant. Whether society fully understood them or not, they clearly mattered deeply to the people involved. As we look back across to centuries, the world of Regency England often appears elegant and romantic. Popular stories focus on grand balls, handsome officers, wealthy estates, and dramatic courtships. Yet beneath those familiar images existed countless personal experiences that rarely appear in novels or films. Among them were women creating lives shaped by affection, loyalty, and companionship in ways that challenged simple expectations. Their stories survived against remarkable odds, hidden in archives, preserved in fading ink, and protected by chance. They continue to offer a richer and more complete understanding of the past. And as we continue our journey through this forgotten corner of history, we discover that some of the most fascinating stories are not the ones shouted loudly across generations, but the quiet ones that waited patiently to be heard. As historians dig deeper into these forgotten lives, they often encounter a surprising problem. The closer they look, the more they realize that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. Many people want clear answers. They want to know exactly what a relationship was, exactly how two people felt, and exactly how society viewed them. But real life is rarely so neat. The women of Regency England lived in a world where emotions were expressed differently than they are today. Language carried different meanings. Social customs created possibilities that can seem unfamiliar to modern readers. Because of this, every letter and diary entry must be understood within the context of its own time. This challenge is part of what makes the subject so fascinating. Rather than finding simple conclusions, historians uncover layers of human experience. Some women clearly devoted their entire lives to one another. Others moved between friendship, companionship, and romance in ways that defy easy labels. Yet regardless of the exact nature of each relationship, one fact remains undeniable. These connections provided comfort, stability, and happiness in a society that often offered women limited control over their futures. For many, a trusted companion became the person they relied upon most. Together they managed households, cared for aging relatives, and supported each other through personal hardships. In an age before modern medicine, before rapid travel, and before many legal rights for women, such support could be essential. It could mean the difference between isolation and belonging. It could transform an uncertain future into a life filled with purpose. The more we learn about these women, the more we understand that their stories are not merely footnotes in history. They are part of the broader human story. They remind us that people in every era have searched for understanding, acceptance, and connection. The details may change from century to century, but those desires remain remarkably constant. As the Regency period faded into history and a new age began, many of these women passed away without realizing that future generations would one day study their letters and wonder about their lives. They could never have imagined scholars carefully reading their words more than 200 years later. Yet that is exactly what happened. Their voices survived. Their emotions survived. And through those surviving fragments, they continue to speak to us across time. In the quiet pages of forgotten correspondence, we find not only evidence of the past, but also a reminder that history is filled with countless hidden lives, each carrying its own hopes, fears, and dreams, waiting patiently for someone to listen. There is also an important question that historians continue to ask. If these relationships were often hidden from official records, how many similar stories have been completely lost? For every collection of letters that survives in an archive, there are countless others that disappeared forever. Paper duque, houses burn. Families throw away old documents without realizing their historical value. Entire lives can vanish from the record in a single generation. This means that the examples we know today may represent only a small fraction of the relationships that actually existed. The surviving evidence is like a handful of stars visible in a night sky once filled with many more. Even so, those remaining stars help illuminate a forgotten world. Through them, we gain insight into the daily experiences of women whose voices were rarely included in traditional history books. We see how they navigated expectations, balanced personal desires against social obligations, and built meaningful relationships despite numerous limitations. We also discover how adaptable people can be when faced with restrictive circumstances. Rather than openly challenging society, many women worked within its boundaries. They found spaces where affection could exist, where companionship could flourish, and where private happiness could be protected from public scrutiny. This quiet resilience is one of the most remarkable aspects of their story. They did not always have the freedom to live exactly as they wished. Yet they still found ways to create lives filled with emotional richness. In many respects, their experiences reveal a side of Regency England that is far more complex than the polished image often presented in popular culture. Behind elegant gowns and formal manners were real individuals dealing with loneliness, hope, disappointment, and love. These emotions connected people across class boundaries and social expectations, whether living in a grand country estate or a modest household. Many women faced similar questions about friendship, loyalty, and the future. As modern readers, we may never know every detail of their lives. Some mysteries will remain unsolved. Certain letters hint at feelings that can no longer be fully understood, because too much context has been lost. Yet perhaps that uncertainty is part of the story itself. History does not always provide complete answers. Sometimes it offers fragments, inviting us to look more carefully and imagine the lives behind the surviving words. And in those fragments, we encounter women who refuse to be defined entirely by the expectations of their age. Their relationships, whatever form they took, became an important source of strength and meaning. Through patience, devotion, and mutual support, they created connections that endured long after the candlelight of the Regency era faded into the past. By the early 19th century, the world around these women was changing in ways they could scarcely imagine. New ideas about society, education, and personal freedom were beginning to emerge. Yet, for most women, daily life still revolved around family expectations and social duties. A daughter was expected to be obedient. A wife was expected to support her husband. A respectable woman was expected to avoid controversy. Against this backdrop, the emotional bonds formed between some women could become extraordinarily significant. These relationships offered understanding in a society where many women had limited opportunities to express their true feelings. A trusted companion could become the one person who listened without judgment, shared private concerns, and provided encouragement during difficult times. Such connections often grew stronger with age. While youthful friendships sometimes faded, other partnerships endured year after year, surviving changes in fortune, health, and circumstance. In several surviving accounts, women describe their companions as the most important presence in their lives. They celebrated holidays together, travelled together, and cared for one another during periods of illness. When one faced hardship, the other offered support. When one experienced loss, the other provided comfort. These acts of devotion may not have attracted public attention, but they shaped everyday life in profound ways. Historians studying these relationships often note how deeply practical and emotional support became intertwined. Affection was expressed not only through words but through actions. Looking after a sick companion, managing household responsibilities, or remaining loyal during difficult years could be just as meaningful as any letter filled with declarations of love. This reminds us that strong relationships are often built through countless small acts repeated over time. As decades passed, some women found themselves growing old, alongside the companions they had chosen years earlier. Together they witnessed changing fashions, political events, and social transformations. Entire generations came and went while their partnership remained constant. In a world where much could change unexpectedly, that stability was precious. Yet even the strongest relationships could not escape the passage of time. Aging brought new challenges. Illness became more common. Friends and relatives passed away. The future grew uncertain. During these later years, surviving letters sometimes reveal an even greater appreciation for companionship. Women who had shared much of their lives together often expressed gratitude for the comfort and support they continued to provide one another. Reading these words today, it becomes clear that their stories are about far more than social history alone. They are stories about loyalty, resilience, and the human desire to belong. Across more than 2 centuries, those emotions remain instantly recognizable. They remind us that beneath the formal appearance of Regency England lived ordinary people whose hopes and fears were not so different from our own. The further we move into the lives of these women, the more we begin to understand that history is often written from the outside, while real life is lived from within. Newspapers recorded political debates. Officials documented laws and property. Wealthy families preserved records of marriages and inheritances. Yet the quiet emotions that shaped everyday existence were rarely considered important enough to preserve. Because of this, many of the most meaningful moments in a person's life remained hidden from public view. A conversation beside a fireplace, a walk through a garden at sunset, a letter read over and over again before being carefully folded and placed in a drawer. These moments may have seemed ordinary at the time, yet they often carried enormous emotional significance. For many women in Regency England, companionship offered a refuge from the pressures surrounding them. Society constantly reminded them of what they were expected to become. Families discussed suitable marriages. Friends spoke about future households and children. Every social gathering seemed connected to expectations about status and reputation. Amid all of this, finding someone who truly understood them could feel incredibly valuable. Some women described feeling more comfortable, sharing their deepest thoughts with a trusted companion than with anyone else in their lives. They spoke openly about fears, disappointments, hopes, and ambitions. Such honesty created bonds that sometimes lasted a lifetime. It is also worth remembering that Regency England could be a lonely place. Travel was slow. Communication depended on letters that might take days to arrive. Illness was common. Many people experienced the loss of loved ones at relatively young ages. In such a world, emotional support was not merely comforting, it was essential. A devoted companion could provide stability during uncertain times and help transform hardship into something bearable. As historians piece together these stories, they often encounter evidence of extraordinary loyalty. Women remained by each other's sides through financial difficulties, family conflicts, and declining health. They made sacrifices for one another and continued offering support. Even when circumstances became difficult, these acts rarely appeared in official records. Yet they reveal the true strength of many relationships. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the history of Regency England is far richer than the familiar stories of aristocrats, soldiers, and political leaders. Hidden beneath those larger narratives are countless personal stories of affection and devotion. Some of those stories survived only because a few fragile letters escaped destruction. Others survive because a diary was forgotten in an attic or preserved by chance. Together they reveal a world of human connection that existed quietly alongside the grand events of history, reminding us that the most important parts of life are often the ones least likely to appear in history books. Another fascinating detail emerges when we examine how these women were remembered after their deaths. In many cases, surviving family members described them using words such as devoted, faithful, respectable, and affectionate. These descriptions often praised their character, but revealed very little about the emotional depth of their private lives. Entire decades of companionship could be summarized in only a few lines. A woman who had shared a home with another woman for 30 or 40 years might simply be remembered as a dear friend or loyal companion. To modern readers, such descriptions can seem incomplete, yet they also demonstrate how different relationships were understood and recorded during that era. What mattered most to many contemporaries was that a person had lived honourably, according to social expectations. The details of personal affection were often considered private matters. Because of this, historians must sometimes read between the lines, leaving most possessions to a long-time companion, a request to be buried near a particular person, a collection of letters preserved with unusual care. These small details can reveal relationships that played a central role in someone's life. They remind us that history often survives through clues rather than direct statements. As the 19th century progressed, society itself continued evolving. New attitudes toward gender, family, and relationships slowly began to emerge. Some forms of companionship that had once been viewed as ordinary became subject to greater scrutiny. In certain ways, the quiet ambiguity that had protected some women during the Regency era became harder to maintain. Social categories grew more rigid, and people increasingly attempted to classify relationships according to specific definitions. Yet the women whose stories we have followed belong to an earlier world. They lived during a period when affection could sometimes exist in spaces that later generations would struggle to understand. This makes their experiences especially valuable to historians. Their lives reveal how human relationships can take many forms, depending on the culture and era in which they exist. Most importantly, these stories challenge the assumption that the past was simple or uniform. Regency England was not populated by identical people living identical lives. It was filled with individuals making choices, forming attachments, and searching for happiness in ways both familiar and surprising. Every recovered letter adds another voice to that forgotten world. Every diary entry brings us closer to understanding the people behind the historical image. And as we continue uncovering these hidden stories, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human experience. Beneath the elegant clothing, formal manners, and strict social rules of Regency, society lived real people whose emotions were every bit as powerful as our own, even if history nearly forgot they were ever there at all. Perhaps one of the greatest misconceptions about the past is the belief that people long ago thought and felt in completely different ways from us. The customs of Regency England may seem distant, but the emotions preserved in surviving letters often feel remarkably modern. Excitement before seeing someone special, sadness after a separation, fear of losing a cherished companion, gratitude for kindness during difficult times. These feelings appear again and again throughout the historical record. They remind us that while societies change, human emotions remain surprisingly constant. The women whose stories survive from this period were not trying to become historical figures. They were simply living their lives. They worried about health, finances, family responsibilities, and the future. They experienced moments of happiness and moments of heartbreak. Like people in every era, they sought understanding and connection in a world that often felt uncertain. This ordinary humanity is what makes their stories so compelling. We are not reading about distant legends. We are reading about real individuals whose lives unfolded one day at a time. Historians often describe archives as places filled with silent voices, waiting to be heard. Few subjects demonstrate this more clearly than the relationships we have been exploring. A faded page covered in old handwriting may seem insignificant at first glance. Yet within those lines can be an entire world of emotion. A simple sentence written 200 years ago can reveal affection strong enough to survive centuries. That is one reason these stories continue to fascinate researchers. They show how much history remains hidden beneath the surface of familiar narratives. The grand events of the Regency era are well known, but countless personal experiences remained invisible for generations. Today, scholars continue uncovering new evidence and re-examining old assumptions. Each discovery adds another piece to a much larger picture. We may never know every detail of these women's lives, but we know enough to recognize their importance. Their experiences expand our understanding of the past and remind us that history is far more diverse than it sometimes appears. As another chapter of this story comes to a close, imagine the quiet evening of a Regency household. Candles burn low. The day's conversations have ended. Somewhere, a woman sits beside a window reading a treasured letter once more before carefully placing it away for safekeeping. She cannot know that centuries later someone will study those words and wonder about her life. Yet, because that letter survived, a small part of her world survived as well, carrying her thoughts across time and allowing her story to be remembered long after the age she knew has passed into history. As we continue exploring this hidden corner of Regency history, it becomes clear that silence itself played a powerful role in shaping people's lives. Silence protected reputations. Silence prevented questions. Silence allowed certain relationships to exist without attracting unwanted attention. Yet silence also came with a cost. Many women could never openly describe the importance of the person they loved most. They could not always explain their feelings in ways that future generations would easily understand. Instead, they left behind fragments, carefully chosen words, treasured keepsakes, and occasional glimpses into their private thoughts. Historians often compare this process to assembling a puzzle with many missing pieces. The picture is incomplete, but enough remains to reveal something meaningful. One particularly striking feature of surviving letters is the language of devotion. Women frequently promised lifelong loyalty to one another. They expressed hopes of spending future years together and spoke of their companions as sources of comfort, happiness, and strength. In some cases, separation caused genuine emotional suffering. Weeks or months apart felt unbearable. Reunions were anticipated with excitement and relief. Such descriptions remind us that these relationships were not minor parts of their lives. For many women, they stood at the centre of their emotional world. At the same time, daily responsibilities never disappeared. Households required management. Relatives needed care. Financial concerns demanded attention. Life continued with all its ordinary challenges. Perhaps this is what makes these stories feel so real. They are not tales of perfect romance untouched by hardship. They are stories about people balancing affection with practical realities. They faced obstacles, compromises, misunderstandings, and uncertainty, just as people do today. Through it all, companionship remained a source of stability. As years passed and memories accumulated, shared experiences often became the foundation of lasting bonds. A journey taken together. A difficult winter survived side by side. A personal loss endured with mutual support. These moments strengthened relationships in ways that formal records could never capture. Looking back now, we can see that the true significance of these women's lives extends beyond any single definition or label. Their stories reveal the many ways human beings create meaning through connection. They demonstrate how affection can flourish even within restrictive societies and how people find opportunities for happiness despite limitations. Most importantly, they remind us that history is not only the story of governments, wars, and famous individuals. IT is also Sanduta story of ordinary people whose private emotions shaped the course of their lives. Hidden behind the elegant image of Regency England were countless personal worlds filled with hope, devotion, longing, and companionship, thanks to the letters and diaries that survived. A small part of those worlds remains visible today, allowing us to understand the past with greater depth, empathy, and humanity. The more we study these stories, the more we realize that many of the most important parts of life leave the smallest traces behind. A royal decree may survive for centuries in official archives. A famous battle may fill entire books. Yet a relationship that shaped someone's happiness for decades might survive only through a handful of letters tucked away in an old box. This imbalance is one reason historians have become increasingly interested in personal documents. They reveal aspects of the past that traditional history often overlooked. Through private correspondence, we gain access to emotions, fears, and dreams that rarely appeared in public records. The women of Regency England were no exception. Their letters reveal moments of excitement, anxiety, affection, and hope that make them feel startlingly close despite the centuries that separate us. Sometimes a single sentence can transform our understanding of an entire life. A brief expression of longing, a promise never to forget someone, a declaration of gratitude for years of companionship. Such words remind us that history is ultimately about people rather than dates or events. Behind every era are individuals trying to find purpose and happiness within the circumstances they have been given. The women whose lives we have explored faced a society filled with expectations and limitations. Yet they continued building relationships that brought meaning to their lives. Some of those relationships lasted only a few years. Others endured for decades. A few survived almost entirely through written correspondence. Regardless of their form, they demonstrate the remarkable importance of emotional connection in human life. Another fascinating aspect of these stories is how ordinary they often seem to the people living them. Many women were not attempting to challenge society or make history. They simply cared deeply about someone and wished to remain close to them. Their daily routines included reading, writing letters, visiting friends, managing households, and participating in social life. Yet, Beneath these ordinary activities existed relationships that would later attract the attention of historians. This reminds us that extraordinary stories are often hidden within ordinary lives. We do not need dramatic events to find meaningful history. Sometimes the most revealing evidence comes from quiet moments, recorded without any expectation that future generations would ever read them. As evening settled across Regency England and candlelight flickered against the walls of homes both large and small, countless conversations took place that would never appear in official records. Most of those voices have been lost forever, yet a few survived. Through surviving letters and diaries, we can still hear echoes of lives once thought forgotten. Their words continue crossing the centuries, reminding us that affection, loyalty, and companionship have always been among the most powerful forces shaping human experience, no matter the era in which people lived. As historians continue uncovering forgotten archives and private collections, new pieces of this story occasionally come to light. A bundle of letters found in an attic, a diary preserved by descendants, a family document that escaped destruction by pure chance. Each discovery has the potential to change what we know about the past. What is especially striking is how often these materials reveal lives far richer and more complex than earlier generations assumed. The traditional image of Regency England focuses on elegance, social rules, and carefully arranged marriages. While those elements certainly existed, they represent only part of the picture. Real people rarely fit perfectly into the expectations placed upon them. They formed friendships, created private worlds, and made choices that reflected their own emotions as much as society's demands. The women whose stories survive from this era demonstrate that reality with remarkable clarity. Many found ways to build meaningful lives within a system that offered limited freedom. They adapted, negotiated. Enzymes quietly resisted expectations. Through the choices they made about companionship and loyalty. One reason these stories remain important today is that they challenge us to think differently about history itself. The past is often presented as a series of clear facts and simple categories, but human lives are rarely simple. Relationships can be difficult to define. Emotions do not always fit neatly into labels. The experiences of these women remind us that people have always been more complex than the societies around them, sometimes recognized. Their lives existed in the spaces between official rules and personal reality. In those spaces they created friendships, partnerships, and emotional bonds that sustained them through changing circumstances. They celebrated joyful moments together and endured painful ones. They watched seasons pass, families grow older, and the world transform around them. Through all of it, companionship often remained a constant source of comfort. Looking back now, perhaps the most valuable lesson from their story is one of empathy. By reading their letters and diaries, we are invited to see the world through their eyes rather than our own. We begin to understand the hopes they carried, the limitations they faced, and the importance of the relationships they cherished. Across more than 200 years, their voices still possess the power to move us. They remind us that every era contains hidden histories waiting to be discovered, and that behind every historical period are countless individuals whose lives matter deeply, even if they were never mentioned in the great records of their age. In the end, their story is not only about Regency England, it is about the enduring human search for understanding, belonging, and connection, a search that links the past to the present in ways that remain as powerful today as they were centuries ago. Even with all the evidence that has survived, there are still many questions that may never be answered. Historians can read letters, study diaries, and examine personal records, but they cannot travel back in time to ask these women what they truly felt. This uncertainty is both frustrating and fascinating. It reminds us that the past is not a perfectly preserved photograph. Instead, it is a collection of memories, documents, and clues that must be carefully interpreted. Yet sometimes the unanswered questions are what make history most interesting. They encourage us to look closer and think more deeply about the lives of people who came before us. What we do know is that many women formed relationships that brought comfort, joy, and stability to their lives. Those bonds often endured through years of change and uncertainty. They survived social pressure, family expectations, and the challenges of everyday life. In many ways, their loyalty to one another was extraordinary. As the Regency era drew to a close, the world slowly moved forward. New fashions appeared. New political debates emerged. Entire generations grew up without knowing the private stories hidden within old letters and diaries. Most of the women we have discussed faded into obscurity. Their homes disappeared, their possessions were scattered, and many of their names were forgotten. Yet their words endured. Because a few documents survived, we can still glimpse the emotions that shaped their lives. We can still see evidence of affection, companionship, and devotion preserved across centuries. That survival is remarkable in itself. It allows us to understand that history is not only made by kings, generals, and famous politicians. It is also created by ordinary people whose personal relationships gave meaning to their lives. The women of Regency England left behind more than faded ink on old paper. They left behind a reminder that every generation contains hidden stories. Some remain unnoticed for decades. Others wait centuries before being rediscovered. And when they finally emerge, they often reveal a past far more human, complex, and fascinating than we ever imagined. As we reach the later chapters of this story, it becomes clear that the greatest legacy of these women is not found in monuments or public celebrations. Their legacy survives in something much quieter. It survives in the evidence that human beings have always searched for companionship and understanding, regardless of the rules imposed by society. The women of Regency England lived within a world of strict expectations, yet they still found ways to build meaningful relationships and create lives filled with affection and loyalty. Their experiences remind us that history is not simply a record of what societies allowed. It is also a record of how ordinary people lived within those societies, adapting to circumstances, while holding onto the connections that mattered most to them. When modern historians open a centuries-old letter and read words written by candlelight long ago, they are doing more than studying a document. They are encountering A real person whose hopes and emotions once shaped an entire world of private experiences. That connection across time is one of the most remarkable aspects of historical research. It allows forgotten voices to speak again. Many of the women whose stories we have explored never imagined that anyone beyond their closest companions would read their personal thoughts. Yet today, their words continue to inspire curiosity and discussion. They encourage us to view the past with greater compassion and a deeper appreciation for its complexity. Most importantly, they remind us that behind every historical era are individuals whose lives cannot be fully understood through laws, dates, or official records alone. To understand history, we must also understand people. We must listen to their letters, examine their memories, and consider the emotions that guided their decisions. In doing so, we discover that the past is not as distant as it sometimes appears. The world of Regency England may be gone, but the human desire for connection, loyalty, and belonging remains unchanged. And it is through those timeless emotions that the women of this forgotten history continue to speak to us more than 200 years after their age came to an end. Yet, perhaps the most surprising aspect of this history is how long it remained largely unnoticed. For generations, scholars focused on political events, military campaigns, and the lives of famous men. Countless personal stories were pushed into the background simply because they were not considered important. At this time, only in recent decades have historians begun examining everyday experiences with the attention they deserve. As they did, a richer and more detailed picture of Regency society started to emerge. The world was no longer populated only by aristocrats attending grand balls or politicians debating national affairs. It became filled with ordinary individuals whose private lives were just as complex as those of people today. Among them were women who formed deep emotional bonds that helped shape the course of their lives. These relationships may not have altered governments or changed the outcome of wars, but they changed the lives of the people involved, and that alone makes them historically significant. History is not measured only by public influence, it is also measured by personal meaning. A friendship, a partnership, or a lifelong companionship can be every bit as important to an individual as a major historical event. This perspective helps us understand why surviving letters are so valuable. They reveal what mattered most to the people who wrote them. Again and again, we find evidence of affection, trust, loyalty, and devotion. We find women expressing gratitude for the presence of someone who made life brighter and more bearable. We find people supporting one another through illness, grief, disappointment, and uncertainty. These are universal experiences that transcend time. Reading such accounts reminds us that people in the Regency era laughed, worried, hoped, and dreamed much like we do today. The details of their world were different, but their emotions were familiar. As more archives are studied and more forgotten documents are uncovered, historians will likely continue finding new pieces of this story. Some discoveries may confirm existing theories. Others may challenge them. That is the nature of historical research. The past is never completely finished. Each generation asks new questions and finds new ways of understanding old evidence. For now, what remains undeniable is that the women whose lives we have explored left behind a legacy of resilience and human connection. Though many of their names have faded from memory, their experiences continue to enrich our understanding of the past. Through their surviving words, they remind us that history is not only about the people who stood at the centre of public attention. It is also about those who lived quietly, loved deeply, and left traces of their lives for future generations to rediscover. As we look even deeper into the lives of these women, we begin to understand that many of them were living through a period of enormous change. The Regency era was not frozen in time. New ideas were spreading through books, newspapers, and conversations. The British Empire was expanding, cities were growing, and society itself was slowly evolving. Yet while these large historical forces transformed the nation, most people remained focused on the concerns closest to them. They worried about family, health, financial security, and the people they cared about most. For many women, personal relationships formed the centre of daily life. A trusted companion could provide emotional support that no social status or amount of wealth could replace. This helps explain why so many letters from the period contain such powerful expressions of affection. These women were writing not merely to pass the time, but to maintain connections that brought meaning to their lives. Some corresponded for decades, preserving friendships and partnerships across long distances. Every letter carried news, comfort, encouragement, and reassurance. In an age before telephones or instant communication, written words held tremendous importance. A letter might be read repeatedly, treasured for months, and carefully stored among a person's most valued possessions. Historians often note that these collections of correspondence create an emotional map of the past. Through them, we can trace moments of happiness, anxiety, excitement, and grief. We can watch relationships grow stronger over time and observe how individuals responded to challenges. In cases, the deepest relationships were not necessarily the most visible ones. Public life followed certain expectations, but private life often told a more complicated story. This contrast between appearance and reality is one of the reasons the Regency period remains so fascinating. Beneath the elegant surface portrayed in popular culture existed countless hidden experiences. Some have been lost forever, while others survive in enough detail to allow us brief glimpses into another world. The women at the heart of these stories may never have considered themselves unusual. They were simply living according to their circumstances, making choices as best they could within the limitations of their time. Yet their lives reveal an important truth. Human beings have always sought understanding, affection, and companionship. These desires transcend generations, cultures, and social systems. They connect us to people who lived centuries before our own time. And as we continue exploring the forgotten corners of history, we are reminded that some of the most meaningful stories are not those found in official records, but those preserved in the quiet words people wrote to the individuals they cherished most. Perhaps the greatest value of these stories is that they encourage us to view the past with greater patience and curiosity. It is easy to assume that history is already understood, that every important story has been told, and that the people who lived centuries ago were fundamentally different from us. Yet the more historians investigate personal records from the Regency era, the more they discover how incomplete that assumption can be. Behind every surviving letter is a person with hopes and fears. Behind every diary entry is someone trying to make sense of the world around them. The women whose lives we have been exploring were not symbols or historical theories. They were individuals navigating real challenges. They experienced uncertainty about the future, concern for loved ones, and the desire to find happiness wherever they could. Their relationships often became sources of strength during difficult periods of life, whether facing family pressure, financial problems, illness, or personal disappointment. Many relied upon trusted companions who offered encouragement and understanding. This support could be life-changing in a society where women often had limited opportunities to make independent choices. Having someone who genuinely cared for them provided comfort that cannot easily be measured. As researchers continue examining archives, they frequently encounter evidence of remarkable emotional resilience. Even during periods of separation, many women maintained close bonds through correspondence. Weeks might pass between letters, yet their commitment remained strong. Some preserved every letter they received, carefully tying them together with ribbons or storing them in locked boxes. These collections became treasured records of relationships that shaped entire lifetimes. Reading them today feels almost like listening to conversations that were never intended for public ears. They reveal honesty, vulnerability, and affection in ways that official documents rarely do. Through such records, we gain access to a side of history that statistics and government records can never provide. We begin to understand not only what people did, but how they felt. That emotional perspective is essential for understanding the past in a meaningful way. The story of these women reminds us that history is not simply a sequence of events. It is a collection of human experiences. Some were celebrated and remembered. Others remained hidden for generations. Yet all of them contributed to the rich complexity of the world that came before us. And as we continue uncovering these forgotten lives, we are reminded that every era contains voices waiting to be heard, stories waiting to be rediscovered, and lessons that can still speak to us long after their people who lived them have passed into history. As the modern world continues to examine forgotten corners of history, the experiences of these women serve as an important reminder that the past is often far more diverse than it first appears. For a long time, historical narratives focused on the loudest voices and the most visible events. Kings, politicians, military leaders, and wealthy landowners dominated the pages of history books. Meanwhile, countless personal stories remained hidden in archives, private collections, and family records. The women of Regency England, whose lives survive through letters and diaries, represent only a small fraction of those forgotten voices. Yet, even this small fraction reveals a remarkable truth. Human lives have always been shaped by relationships. No matter how powerful governments become, or how dramatically societies change. People continue searching for companionship, trust, and emotional connection. These desires existed in Regency England just as they exist today. The women we have followed throughout this story lived under rules and expectations very different from our own, but their feelings often feel strikingly familiar. They celebrated moments of joy with those they cared about. They worried when loved ones were ill. They felt sadness during long separations and happiness during reunions. In more ways, these emotional experiences bridge the centuries and allow us to recognise ourselves in people who lived long ago. This connection is one of the reasons history remains so valuable. It helps us understand not only how societies functioned, but also how individuals experienced their lives within those societies. Every recovered letter adds another layer to that understanding. Every preserved diary reminds us that behind historical events were real people living ordinary days filled with hopes and concerns. Some of those people left enough evidence for us to reconstruct portions of their lives. Others remain hidden forever. Yet even the incomplete stories matter. They challenge assumptions and encourage us to look beyond simple explanations. The Regency era was not a world of perfect order where everyone followed the same path. It was a living society filled with complexity, contradictions, and deeply personal experiences. The women whose stories survived demonstrate that reality beautifully. Through affection, loyalty, and companionship, they created lives that were meaningful to them, even if history nearly overlooked them. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. The most important parts of a person's life are not always the ones recorded in official documents. Often they are found in private moments, personal relationships, and the quiet bonds that help people navigate an uncertain world. Those bonds may fade from public memory, but when traces of them survive, they offer an extraordinary window into the human heart across time. What makes these stories especially powerful is that they survived. Despite the passage of time, more than 200 years have passed since the Regency era, yet the emotions preserved in old letters still feel alive. Historians often describe the experience of opening a centuries-old document as surprisingly personal. The paper may be faded and fragile, but the thoughts written upon it remain clear. A woman writing about missing someone she deeply cares for. Another expressing gratitude for years of companionship. Someone else describing the comfort of knowing that a trusted friend remains by her side during difficult times. These moments create an emotional connection between past and present that few other historical sources can provide. They remind us that people living in Regency England were not distant figures trapped inside history books. They were individuals with rich inner lives, capable of experiencing the same joys and sorrows that people experience today. As researchers continue studying these materials, they are discovering that emotional history can reveal just as much about a society as political events or economic statistics. By understanding how people formed relationships and supported one another, we gain a clearer picture of everyday life. We begin to see the human reality hidden beneath formal social structures. The women whose lives we have explored existed within a world of expectations. but they were never defined entirely by those expectations. They found ways to create meaningful connections, build lasting companionships, and support one another through life's challenges. Their stories demonstrate resilience, patience, and devotion. They also remind us that history is filled with experiences that cannot always be neatly categorized or easily explained. Human relationships are often more complicated than the labels societies create for them. This was true in the Regency era, and it remains true today. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to attract attention. They encourage us to think beyond simple assumptions and appreciate the complexity of real lives. Every surviving letter represents a voice that refused to disappear completely. Every diary entry offers a glimpse into thoughts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Together, they form a mosaic of experiences that enriches our understanding of the past. And as we continue listening to these voices from long ago, we are reminded that history is not merely a record of what happened. It is also a record of what people felt, what they valued, and whom they cared about most. In those emotions, preserved across centuries, the women of Regency England continue to leave their mark on the world long after their own time has ended. By now, it may seem surprising that so much of this history remained hidden for so long. Yet this is often how history works. Entire generations can pass without recognizing the significance of certain lives or experiences. What appears ordinary to one era may become fascinating to another. The women whose letters survive from Regency England could never have imagined that scholars centuries later would carefully examine their words. They were not writing for future audiences. They were writing for the people who mattered most to them. That sincerity is what gives these documents such power. There is no attempt to create a public image or leave behind a carefully managed legacy. Instead, we find genuine thoughts and emotions preserved in ink. We find people discussing hopes for the future, worries about health, concerns about family, and the happiness they felt when spending time with cherished companions. These details transform history from something distant into something deeply human. They remind us that the past was once the present for those who lived it. Every person believed their own life was unfolding in real time, filled with uncertainties about what tomorrow might bring. For many women, companionship offered stability in a world where much remained outside their control. Political events might change. Economic conditions might worsen. Family circumstances could shift unexpectedly. Yet a trusted relationship could provide comfort through all of those challenges. This explains why loyalty appears so frequently in surviving correspondence. Again and again, women emphasized the importance of remaining devoted to one another despite distance, hardship, or changing circumstances. Such commitments often became defining features of their lives. Historians studying these relationships frequently note that emotional support was not viewed as a minor matter. It was considered essential to personal well-being. People relied upon one another in ways that modern readers can still understand. As we continue exploring these forgotten stories, another important lesson emerges. History is not only about discovering what happened, it is also about understanding why certain stories were remembered while others were neglected. The lives of these women challenge us to pay attention to voices that were once ignored. They encourage us to look beyond traditional narratives and consider the experiences of ordinary individuals whose personal relationships shaped their worlds. Though centuries have passed, the emotions preserved in their letters remain remarkably vivid. Their words continue reminding us that affection, trust, and companionship have always played a central role in human life. And through those surviving words, people who might otherwise have vanished from history continue speaking to us today, offering insight into a past that was far more complex and deeply human than many once believed. As historians reflect upon these stories today, many agree that their importance extends far beyond the Regency era itself. The relationships we have explored are valuable not only because they reveal something about one period of British history, but because they demonstrate how human experiences can remain hidden beneath surface of official records every generation leaves behind to histories. One is the public history found in newspapers, government documents, and political events. The other is a private history made up of personal conversations, friendships, hopes, disappointments, and relationships. The first history is usually easier to preserve. The second is far more fragile. It survives only when someone keeps a letter, saves a diary, or passes down a collection of papers through the generations. The women whose lives we have followed belong largely to this second history. Their stories endured because small pieces of evidence escaped destruction and neglect. Those pieces allow us to see a side of Regency England that official accounts rarely captured. We see people building lives around trust and companionship. We see emotional bonds that remained strong across years of separation and change. We see individuals seeking happiness within a society that often imposed strict expectations upon them. These stories remind us that people have always found creative ways to pursue meaningful relationships, even when circumstances were difficult. They also reveal how much of history remains incomplete. There are undoubtedly countless lives that left no surviving trace at all. Entire relationships may have disappeared without a single letter remaining to tell their story. This realization encouraged humility. Historians must accept that they can never recover every detail of the past. Yet even incomplete evidence can provide valuable insight. A handful of surviving documents can illuminate experiences shared by many others whose voices have been lost. In this way, the women whose letters survived speak not only for themselves but also for a much larger world that can no longer speak directly. As we imagine the final years of the Regency generation, it is worth remembering that most of these women likely believed their stories would be forgotten. They could not know that future readers would find meaning in their words. They could not know that historians would spend years studying their correspondence and trying to understand their lives. Yet that is exactly what happened. Through remarkable chance and careful preservation, their voices endured. And because those voices endured, we are able to glimpse a more complete picture of the past. One that includes not only public achievements and famous events, but also the quiet relationships that gave ordinary lives their deepest meaning. Perhaps what makes these women so fascinating to modern readers is that they existed at the intersection of visibility and invisibility. In one sense, they were ordinary members of society. They attended gatherings, visited relatives, wrote letters, and participated in the daily routines expected of respectable women. Yet, in another sense, important parts of their lives remained largely unseen by the wider world. Their deepest emotions were often shared only with a trusted companion. Their most meaningful conversations took place in private. Their greatest joys and sorrows rarely appeared in official records. Because of this, historians must rely on the traces they left behind. Fortunately, those traces are sometimes surprisingly rich. A diary may reveal years of affection. A collection of correspondence may document the growth of a relationship from youthful friendship into lifelong companionship. Through such records, we gain access to experiences that would otherwise be impossible to recover. The result is a portrait of Regency society that feels far more human and nuanced than the simplified version often presented in popular culture. We begin to understand that beneath the formal etiquette and strict social expectations existed individuals with unique personalities, desires, and emotional lives. Some followed conventional paths. Others quietly forged different ones. All of them contributed to the complex social fabric of their era. One reason these stories continue to resonate is that they raise timeless questions about love, loyalty, identity, and belonging. How do people maintain meaningful relationships in a world filled with expectations? How do they balance personal happiness with social responsibility? How do they preserve important connections when circumstances threaten to pull them apart? These are questions that remain relevant in every generation. The women of Regency England may have faced them under different conditions, but the underlying human experience remains familiar. As researchers continue uncovering new evidence, our understanding of these lives will undoubtedly continue evolving. New letters may be discovered. Forgotten diaries may emerge from private collections. Existing documents may be interpreted in new ways. Each discovery adds another layer to a story that is still being told. This ongoing process reminds us that history is never completely finished. It is a conversation between the present and the past, shaped by new questions and new perspectives. And through that conversation, the voices of these women continue reaching across the centuries. Their words, preserved against remarkable odds, allow us to see beyond stereotypes and assumptions. They reveal a world of affection, companionship, and emotional resilience that existed quietly alongside the grand events of history. In doing so, they ensure that lives once overlooked are no longer forgotten. As the 19th century moved forward and the Regency era slowly faded into memory, many of the women whose stories we have explored disappeared from public attention. New generations arrived with different concerns, different customs, and different ways of understanding relationships. Houses changed ownership. Families scattered across the country. Personal belongings were sorted, sold, inherited, or discarded. In many cases only pure luck determined whether a collection of letters survived. A box forgotten in an attic might preserve decades of history. Another box, thrown into a fire during a house cleaning, could erase an entire life story forever. This fragile nature of historical evidence is one reason researchers treasure every surviving document. Each letter represents a rare opportunity to hear a voice from the past, speaking in its own words. When historians read these letters, they often discover something unexpected. The women writing them were not thinking about how future generations would interpret their lives. They were concerned with immediate matters: health, travel plans, family news, financial worries, and the people they cared about most. Because of this, their writing often feels remarkably authentic. There is little sense of performance. Instead, we encounter genuine emotion. We see excitement when a reunion is approaching. We see disappointment when plans fall apart. We see comfort offered during illness and grief. These emotional details help transform historical figures into real people. They remind us that the past was populated by individuals whose lives were every bit as complex as our own. Another fascinating aspect of this story is how it challenges the idea that history moves in a straight line. People often imagine the past as simpler than the present, but reality is rarely so straightforward. Human relationships have always been diverse and complicated. The experiences of these women demonstrate that clearly. Their lives do not fit neatly into modern assumptions or historical stereotypes. Instead, they reveal a society filled with nuance and contradiction. Public expectations existed, yet private realities often looked very different. This tension between appearance and reality is one of the most enduring themes in the study of Regency England. The more closely we examine personal records, the more complexity we uncover. Every diary and letter adds another layer to our understanding. As a result, the past becomes less distant and more human. We begin to recognize familiar emotions hidden beneath unfamiliar customs. We see people striving for happiness, security, and connection just as people do today. And through those discoveries, we gain not only a deeper understanding of history, but also a greater appreciation for the countless ordinary lives that quietly shaped it from behind the scenes. The further historians look into these forgotten lives, the more they realize that companionship was often one of the most valuable resources a person could possess. In Regency England, opportunities for women were limited compared to those available to men. Education, property rights, and financial independence were often restricted by social expectations and legal realities. Under such conditions, trusted relationships became especially important. A loyal companion could offer advice during difficult decisions, provide support during illness, and bring comfort during periods of loneliness. Many women depended on these relationships not simply for happiness but for emotional survival. This helps explain why surviving letters frequently contain expressions of gratitude and devotion. The writers understood the value of having someone who truly understood them. In a world where public appearances mattered greatly, private trust became precious. Historians often note that these relationships reveal a side of Regency society rarely discussed in official accounts. Political speeches and government records tell us how institutions functioned, but personal letters reveal how people actually lived. Through them, we learn what individuals feared, what they hoped for, and what they treasured most. Again and again, we find evidence that emotional connection occupied a central place in people's lives. Some women described their companions as sources of strength during moments of uncertainty. Others spoke of feeling incomplete when separated for long periods. Such statements remind us that relationships have always shaped the human experience in profound ways. They influence decisions, provide comfort, and help people endure challenges that might otherwise feel overwhelming. As we read these stories today, it becomes easier to understand why historians continue returning to them. They offer more than information about the past. They offer insight into universal aspects of human nature, the desire to be understood, the need for trust, the comfort of knowing someone cares deeply about our well-being. These experiences transcend time and place. Whether in Regency England or the modern world, they remain essential parts of life. That is why these forgotten letters continue to matter. They preserve evidence of emotions that would otherwise have vanished completely. Through them, ordinary women whose names were nearly lost too. History continues sharing their experiences with future generations. Their voices remind us that history is not only a record of public events, it is also a record of private lives, personal relationships, and the quiet connections that give meaning to everyday existence. And in those connections, preserved across centuries, we find some of the most powerful and enduring stories the past has to offer. And so, as our journey through Regency England quietly comes to an end, we are left with a deeper understanding of a world that was far more complex than it first appeared. Behind the elegant gowns, grandry costumes, formal dances, and strict social rules lived real people with real emotions. Many of the women whose stories survive today were not famous. They did not lead armies, govern nations, or leave behind great monuments. Instead, they lived ordinary lives shaped by friendship, loyalty, companionship, and affection. Yet it is often these ordinary lives that reveal the most about the human experience. Through faded letters and carefully preserved diaries, we catch brief glimpses of moments that once seemed small, but now feel incredibly meaningful. A handwritten note sent across the countryside, a promise of lifelong devotion, a reunion after months apart, a quiet evening spent in the company of someone deeply trusted. These moments remind us that history is not only about dramatic events. It is also about the relationships that give people's lives purpose and comfort. The women of Regency. England faced expectations and limitations that modern people may find difficult to imagine. Even so, they found ways to create meaningful connections and build lives filled with emotional richness. Their stories challenge us to look beyond simple assumptions about the past and to recognize the diversity of experiences that existed beneath the surface of society. They teach us that human beings have always searched for understanding, belonging, and companionship. Those desires have never changed. They connect us to people who lived centuries before our own time. Perhaps that is why these forgotten voices continue to resonate today. Across more than 200 years, their words still carry warmth, hope, sadness, and devotion. They remind us that every generation leaves behind hidden stories waiting to be rediscovered. Some survive by chance, preserved in old boxes and dusty archives. Others disappear forever. But the stories that remain offer a rare gift. They allow us to hear people from the past speaking in their own voices and sharing the emotions that shaped their lives. As the candles burn low and the final pages of this chapter close, the women of Regency England slowly fade back into history. Yet their voices remain. They remain in the letters they wrote, the memories they left behind, and the lessons they continue to teach us about loyalty, friendship, resilience, and the enduring human need for connection. And with that gentle thought, we leave this forgotten corner of the past behind, grateful for the stories it shared and the lives it allowed us to remember. Good night, and until our next journey into history, sleep well.